Okay, apologies for the delay, everybody. We're ready to go now, and you're all very welcome. My name is Malachy Mitchell. I'm the Managing Director of Farley & Mitchell, and welcome to our Supply Chains and Food Security webinar. So over the next 60 minutes or so, we want to give you some insight and perspective into the disruptors of the global food system, be they man-made or natural disasters. I also want to introduce you to our team that will be with us here today in terms of the webinar. Unfortunately, our colleague Shaitanya GRK from our Dubai office won't be able to join us, but I will cover the modern food supply system as it pertains to Europe and the rest of the world. My colleague, engineer Najeeb Alhumaid in our Saudi office will cover vulnerable regions as they pertain to Saudi Arabia. And then our colleague Stephen Awuah in our Ghana office will look at future disruption and how it relates to Africa. And then we'll have some concluding thoughts. So our question really is, can we build a more resilient food system? And if we look at food security and what it really means, there are many different definitions, but in essence, what it means is safe, nutritious and affordable food to all. Unfortunately, we live in a world that's not the case. In the developed world, food security is impacted in different ways than in the developing world. And COVID-19 has really brought all of this into very sharp focus in many respects, as governments have had to rethink policies, and consumers have to probably not realize that food can no longer be taken for granted, that it's on our shelves every day we go to the shops. So the virus is driving food security policy review. And in addition to that, we have 7% of the population in the developed world that rely on food banks, and that's only increasing. And up to 20% of the population have households that are food insecure. So food security is a very real issue, even in the developed world. In developing countries, the situation is way more pronounced. And in that situation, it's driven by a number of factors and many complex factors, but one overriding one is productivity and output, and the fact that low yields are a real drawback or drag, if you like, in terms of the issues and challenges that are faced by developing nations. And this is for a multiple of reasons. Poor quality inputs, climate change is playing an increasing and central role to the disruption of crop output and production generally. And 98% of the 800 million people on the world live in the developing world that go hungry every night. So that's a staggering figure in itself. The other issue is trade and access to markets, import substitution. Africa alone imports $80 billion a year of food, which is really, when you look at it at any level, it just doesn't make sense when it has such enormous productive capacity and natural resources really to produce all kinds of crops and produce. So looking at the modern food supply system, the global food value chain has a value of something in the order of $8 trillion. It represents 10% of global GDP, and it implies 1.5 billion people. So by any measure, by any level, it's a very, very important sector, and it touches the lives of everybody, obviously, on the planet. In terms of the system itself, it's not perfect. It relies very much on trade and global trade, and it's highly interconnected. And that interconnectedness is a positive in many respects, but it can obviously be a negative. An event in one part of the world can have an immediate impact on another, particularly in terms of supply, which is a knock-on issue in terms of price. So the system is not perfect. Globalization, though, allows comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is really important when we look at food, because some countries can produce certain types of crops or produce or livestock much more efficiently than others. I'm speaking to you today from Ireland, and in Ireland we can produce dairy and beef, particularly extensive based systems that's off grass at low unit costs, and that allows us to produce and export to up to 80% or more of the beef and dairy produce that we produce. We're a country of 5 million, but we produce enough food for over 30 million people. But it also has its disadvantages, globalization, because it consumes land, it consumes resources, and obviously generates emissions, CO2 emissions, which are a key contributor to climate change. Self-sufficiency in itself is also important, and a policy that a lot of governments pursue, but in certain parts of the world, it's simply not practical because of the limited natural resources that exist, that we'll come back to later. An example of kind of globalization maybe gone a little bit mad is pears grown in Argentina, packed in Thailand and consumed in the US. There really is very little economic, logistical rationale for that to happen. And certainly from a sustainability perspective, it's really not on. And that's something that isn't a very sustainable model at any level. The major food supply and the major food supply and how it's concentrated, and some of the kind of connectedness between the various parts of the world. If we look at fertilizer as an example, China has 1/3 of the urea supply, and of course ammonia and urea are vital components in artificial fertilizer, which is a vital input for the production of high quality crops and high yielding crops. And the urea supply is concentrated, 1/3 of it in China. So that's a very efficient market to produce urea and to distribute it globally. It obviously concentrates a significant risk. We also saw this year with COVID, the restrictions that the pandemic brought all over the world, but in a European context, we saw where migrant labor in the eastern part of Europe could not move or could not travel to work in the UK, Ireland, Germany, France, and other countries in Western Europe, where they were heavily depended upon to bring in the harvest, in many cases pick fruit, be part of various production lines. And that caused its own level of disruption. In addition to that, the whole area of the food service channel being restricted and closed down during the lockdown situations, that meant that a lot of companies had to repivot their businesses, their models into the retail channel, which is not very easy because it's a very different market, as a lot of people know. Pricing models are different, the specifications are different, and usually the product ranges are very different as well. And all of these things really impacted in a very significant and severe way for manufacturers, and indeed to some extent for consumers. Switzerland is an interesting country when we look in the developed world, and particularly European context, when we look what they have achieved in terms of a policy and a system when it comes to self-sufficiency. They're a country that depend 40 to 50% reliant on imports, but they've basically engaged with the private sector. About 250 companies work with the government to maintain stockpiles. And this means that the strategic reserves, dairy feed, wheat, flour, sugar, cooking oil, vital commodities, feed and food commodities, are basically stored, maintained and managed by the private sector and coordinated by the government with strong public information campaigns. This is quite a unique model in that most governments would own the assets, the storage assets, the handling facilities, and indeed the stocks themselves, and control them centrally. But this is quite a progressive model and a very good partnership between the private and public sector, and addressing self-sufficiency and, if you like, complementing local production along with global supply. Sticking with the concentrated supply fact and how that can impact and drive vulnerability in supply chains. The US meat industry is a good example. If we look at that, there's been a 70% drop in meat processing plants since the 1960s. And that level of concentration leaves the industry today that up to 2/3 of the processing capacity in the US is actually owned by 3 separate companies. So the largest economy in the world, 330 odd million people, 2/3 of its processing capacity controlled by 3 companies, is really significant level of concentration. And of course, concentration has other implications as well. It brings domination, and domination in the supply chain is risky. It also can mean abuse of power in terms of particularly primary producers, in terms of price, downward pressures in price, downward pressure on options to sell animals. Also, if there are any food safety issues, there are risks for consumers, and of course there are supply risks if anything goes wrong with the plants, and all of these things can impact ultimately the consumer. In the US, the federal government actually stepped in and categorized the assets of the processing assets as strategic infrastructure to ensure that they could stay open during the worst part of the pandemic, during the lockdown period. In Europe, it's a little bit different, but not too much. 1/3 of processing capacity is owned by 15 companies, and that in many cases is increasing, and that's having its own knock-on implications as well, as I referred to, particularly when it comes to the area of primary producers and price. Wheat is one of the most, if not the most important commodity in the world, and it's also a very political commodity in the sense that it impacts the price of bread. And there are 7 regions that basically represent 80% of the wheat that's traded in the world. So an event, a weather event in Kansas, a key part of the grain belt in the United States, can have a real and measurable impact on the supply of wheat, and then of course the downward price pressure or price impact on bread and pasta. And this obviously has a much more profound and harder impact on poorer nations and of course poorer people. So we know that it's one of it's a commodity like other major soft commodities, that there's always a fine balance between supply and demand, and any disruption in that will have a knock-on impact on price, and obviously then the downstream products related to that commodity. So disruptive forces, 10 countries in the world are responsible for 70% of what is traded. The definition of traded of food that leaves one country and goes to another or many other countries. So that's a very high level of concentration across cereals, dairy, fruit and nut, vegetables, fish, edible oils and oilseeds. And the issue of not the issue, but the comment I made earlier about comparative advantage is important in the sense that in its academic sense, it works very well that countries that can produce crops and food products competitively, efficiently, should do that, and they can be exported to other parts of the world. But that does expose the system because of any disruption, be it natural disaster or man-made disruption. And the cost of that disruption, now we know, and it has a real cost, economic cost, and of course environmental cost, is 170 billion, approximately 170 billion a year since 2010 up to 2019. So it is real and it is significant, and that's come from technological and natural disasters. It would be impossible not to talk a little bit about climate change, and it's really something that is, I think, has been somewhat tokenistic to a certain extent, and that's changing, and I think changing for the better. And now it's becoming a very much a central part of the discussion, and in many cases policy and practices, and that I think will only grow and increase, and needs to. So currently, as we stand, the global temperature is set to increase by 4 to 7 degrees Celsius by 2100. That's an extraordinary increase in temperature. 2/3 of the global caloric intake is wheat, rice, maize and soya, and 80% of those crops globally are rain-fed. So it's very easy to see the interconnectedness between a rise in temperature and what that impact will have on the food that we consume, the key commodities, soft commodities that we grow and trade across the world. The other point we need to make as well is that CO2 depletes food nutrient quality. So it also has an impact on the calorific and nutrient value of food. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. And this is particularly, this issue of, or rather the issue of climate change has a really profound impact on the poorer parts of the world. And the lack of resilience when it comes to their agricultural systems compared to the developed part. So it even has a greater impact in the developed world, and it's a bigger issue in that part of the world in terms of their weather systems that prevail there as well. So we just done some quick analysis on the projections of the impact of climate change, and just moving that widget, sorry, and on particular crops. And those crops being the major ones we just talked about: wheat, rice, maize, soybean. And you can see that 1%, 2%, 3%, even 1 to 2%, which might be deemed in the overall scheme of things as a marginal increase in temperatures, has a really measurable impact on the reduction of yields. So even take 10 to 15 or 20% reduction in yields of these key strategic crops. And looking ahead in a world where we live, that the population is increasing, due to increase by at least another 2 billion over the next 30 years. What this will mean is that we would need additional land, additional resources, additional inputs, and in any way you look at it, it means that it will be a vicious cycle in terms of increasing inputs, decreasing outputs, and absorption of natural resources, and resulting in greater emissions. So the whole agricultural model does have to rethink and re-gear itself. And I think ag tech and food tech is making a significant contribution to how we might do that. And that's to be very, very welcomed. And I think that has its application. Particularly we're seeing it in the Middle East, in very arid climate and a very tough climate to produce primary crops. And in that sense, I think it has a big application there, and indeed in Africa as well, and of course other parts of the world. That's an area that we will be addressing in more detail in the near future. Sticking with natural disasters, in Japan in 2011, there was an earthquake which had caused a major nuclear accident in one of their nuclear energy plants. And Japan is the third largest economy in the world, one of the major developed economy when it comes to agriculture, and a big exporter. And 40 countries prevented imports from Japan. Its reputation was significantly impacted as an exporting country, and approximately 80 billion was the cost, $80 billion was the cost to its agricultural economy, with 38,000 agricultural entities damaged. So it had a significant impact to the country, humanitarian impact obviously, but also a very significant economic one, and to its agricultural system. So it is very real as an example what can happen from a natural disaster. And unfortunately, this volatility that's going to come from natural disasters, I think, is only going to increase. And how we have a food system, a global food system that's resilient in that context, is going to become increasingly important. And how we address the underlying causes of the volatility is also going to be important. And that's back to a large extent to climate change and policies by governments and practices by industry. So 9 years on, and we have COVID-19, and it's really impacted every part of the world, every corner of the world. An additional 265 million people have gone hungry in 2020. Additional food loss as migrant labor has been disrupted. I mentioned earlier, America relies on 1 million migrant laborers from Mexico and Africa for their harvest and their food processing industry. And I mentioned also about Europe as well. And there's been a lot of waste and food has gone to waste both in restaurants and also at farm level, as there's also been a switch away from food service channel into retail, and a lot of farmers do not have the crops or the produce to meet the specifications that are demanded by that sector. So there's been significant additional waste in the food system because of COVID-19. Panic buying then and stockpiling pressure in the supply chain. So we had quite a bit of panic buying in the earlier part of the pandemic, and that seems to have largely abated at this stage. But governments also, which is a more serious problem, have stockpiled. Vietnam is a major exporter of rice and sets the price, has a big influence on the price of rice globally. And rice is a really important commodity, particularly in developing countries. And they put embargoes or quotas, I should say, on exports or restrictions. And so did Russia in terms of wheat. So that causes a major disruption. It's never the answer in terms of addressing any shortages in the global food system, and it causes its own price pressure then elsewhere. And we saw in the last 2 months the FAO index, commodity price index, has started to increase. We don't believe it will have a repeat of the 2008 price spike, but nonetheless it has caused its own pressure. And then limited access to inputs by farmers in some regions will obviously cause issues in terms of future harvests and supply from same. And we've lost about 400 million jobs. The UN predicts about 400 million jobs have been lost in the globally, and that will have obviously its own impact in many different respects. So I'm going to now move over to my colleague Najeeb Alhumaid, who's in our Riyadh office, and Najeeb is going to look at vulnerable regions as they relate to Saudi Arabia. Over to you, Najeeb.
Thank you, Malachy.
I think you're on mute, Najeeb.
No, I'm not on mute, but can you hear me now?
Najeeb, you're on mute. Okay now, I think.
Okay now?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Malachy. If we can go to the first slide, please.
Can't hear you, Najeeb. Just.
No, not in the mute.
Okay.
Can we go to the first slide? Okay. If we can see the first slide, if we took the left side of the slide, according to the Global Food Security Index, you will see Saudi Arabia rank was number 30. Of course, Singapore number 1, Ireland number 2. Saudi Arabia was number 30, ahead of Egypt, number 55, or Syria, 107. Just I wanna remind you that both countries, Syria and Egypt, have surplus water sources, while we don't have. So, overall, Saudi Arabia is a very vast country, but unfortunate with lack of stable, suitable land to cultivate, as well as unsuitable climate in most regions during summer or winter, and bear in mind the inability of natural water such as rivers or lakes, which makes really investment in traditional agribusiness is unprofitable at all. So in order to come over the supply chain issue and the self-sufficient issue, the government has deployed a strategy in early 60s to support the agribusiness in Saudi Arabia. Ministry of Environment, Water, Agriculture mandated to implement such a strategy. The strategy was really implemented in two parallel paths. First, public sector, and led by three entities. ADF, which is Agriculture Development Fund, was established in 1962 to provide loans and machinery equipment for all agri activities such as farming, raising cattle, poultry, greenhouses, etc. The second entity is SAGO, Saudi Grain Organization. It was established in 1972 for wheat procurement from local or international farmers and for flour milling as well. The third entity, SALIC, which is Saudi Agriculture and Livestock Investment Company, was established in 2009 and owned by Public Investment Fund. The second parallel path, the first parallel path was the public sector. The second one is the private sector. The private sector was supported heavily by the government subsidies for the commodity, as well as ADF loans, or SAGO's purchases for wheat production, and SALIC as well as a standalone company or as a joint venture with a Saudi investor. But this strategy did not really perform very well. It was good, but there was turbulence. The EU to unnecessarily or misbehave of using natural resource, irrational use of water resource. So the government has to freeze this strategy and come up with a new strategy, or let's say it's to enhance the existing strategy with better strategy. So the government freeze most of open land cultivation activities and launched an initiative to support Saudi investors to invest abroad in agribusiness. That was in 2008. Again, the initiative was driven by two entities. The first one, ADF, Agriculture Development Initiative, an investment abroad approach, where ADF developed a list of approved countries of 30 plus, and it is still open to add additional countries subject to certain criteria such as political stability and other. Saudi investors can farm in this country the required commodities to fulfill the demand of the local markets. The second way is SALIC, which was mandated to invest and to support investment in the basic commodity and others such as wheat, barley, corn, soybean, rice, sugar, fodder, red meat, aquaculture, poultry, either on a direct investment or in a form of joint venture with the private sector of Saudi. According to this strategy, the acquired land by Saudi investor in Africa or Ukraine or Australia or Canada have been risen. Just an example, we have around 200 Saudi investors now in Ethiopia. Malachy, could you please move to the second slide, please? Second slide. Thank you. This will give us the outlook how the government managed the supply chain and the food security on the country. In the 80s, self-sufficient was attempted and tried to reach. Unfortunately, due to so many reasons, we could not reach self-sufficient. And the main reason behind having self-sufficient is to try to mitigate the fluctuating of food prices. In later stage, government has given incentives to local farmers to develop wheat production. Again, to this incentive and to irrational use of natural resources, the government have stopped that and moved to better strategy where to encourage investors to invest abroad. In Saudi Arabia nowadays, we still produce and export a wide range of fresh produced poultry and dairy products. An example, date export was around $200 million in 2019. Could you please move, Malachy, to page 3? Now, the disruptive force on the supply chain is very essential. And in Saudi Arabia, in order to overcome this issue, the government have a hybrid strategy. First one is to invest abroad, as I explained before, or the second one, the second approach is to enhance, to encourage the local farmer to cultivate at least wheat for the human being need. For the local farmers, the government agreed to purchase from local farmers 700,000 metric ton. That was in July this year. Before July. In July, the government announced that they will increase the purchase amount from the local farmer to 1.5 million metric ton for the next coming 5 years. And the price will be based on SAGO purchase price from international market, or 1,250 Saudi Riyal, which is above to support the local farmers. This is on the side of in-house in Saudi Arabia. While in the, outside of Saudi Arabia, we according to the international initiatives, we managed to have a key trade partners such as Ukraine, Russia, India, Pakistan, and we managed to have a safety strategic reserve in Saudi Arabia for the basic commodity. These kind of trade enable the economy strength to trade based on food security policies. But of course, there will be some threat on the export ban or freeze from the partner countries. However, the government is mitigating on the local farmers to fulfill the strategic, the safety strategic reserve whenever we face a shortage. Again, the government is not linked trade partners to only 4 countries. We have a list of 330 country plus. The government is open for diversify the source of food important, and because it's very valuable to mitigate the disruption of any kind of a region or another. And the next slide, I'm gonna give example about the disruption on the region. We are aware that there was a huge explosion, unfortunate, sad explosion happened on Lebanon due to storing ammonia nitrate on the port. Of course, this explosion caused a lot of suffer to Lebanon and a huge loss in terms of economy cost or human side, as 220 deaths were reached, 7,000 injuries, 300,000 homeless. Additional to that, in the port there was a silos to storage corn or soya. So 24,000 tons were completely vanished. 700,000 tons of soya vanished, as well as wheat. Bear in mind the Beirut port is in charge of, or usually it's in charge of 85% of country imported grain. Due to the explosion, Lebanon forced to be under the mercy of the war. We saw that a lot of countries really sent their gesture as a term of vessels or by air flights to come over the shortage of the supply. Now the issue in Lebanon was they were focusing mainly on the imported commodity, and there was complete negligence to local farmers. If we can move to the next slide, please, we will show that the wheat production, on local production, almost flat, while relying on more than, let's say, 80% on the import. So whenever there was a scenario or any accident happened, then they will be facing a shortage. Bear in mind, they don't have any safety strategic reserve. So conclusion, if you want to rely on board, then you have to have a safety strategic reserve on house, additional to have local farmers to support you. Thank you, Malachy.
Thank you, Najeeb, for that. Yeah, Saudi Arabia is a major country when we look at it in the context of the Middle East and obviously globally. It's been very progressive in terms of how it's handled food security, and particularly in the context of strategic reserves. and also more recently in the privatization of its flower sector as well. So there's lots happening there, and I know also in the broader region in the UAE, in terms of greater investment and focus in ag tech in particular, and across the region, greater interest in forming and developing alliances, in international alliances and partnerships to, if you like, solidify their supply, food security and supply chain strategies. So we now go to Africa and to our office there in Ghana, and to speak with our colleague Stephen Awuah, who's Senior Manager. And Stephen, you can walk us through some future disruption and how that relates to Africa.
Hello. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Malachy, let's go to the next slide, please.
Okay.
Good. Africa is quite a huge continent, 55 countries, 1.5 billion people, 1.2 billion people, with a GDP of $2.5 trillion. So one may ask, why should Africa be vulnerable to disruptions and pandemics like the COVID-19? Now, what can Africa do? Africa has become vulnerable because of lack of capital and lack of self-sufficiency. Africa is rich in terms of resources, but then very poor capital, access to capital. And a country with such huge resources, come to think of it, why should we import food to the tune of $80 billion annually? So, what has brought us to this place is the fact that African farmers, mostly smallholder farmers, farm at the subsistence level, use very old, outdated methods of production. So the result is usually very low yields. On the other hand, when there are disruptions and Africa is unable to meet its food needs, governments also lack enough budget, to be able to respond to market price spikes, as well as to bridge the gap, of supply of commodities. And these makes Africa more vulnerable. Now, what can Africa do? As someone who say there is light at the end of the tunnel. Because if you look at the graph on my left, you could clearly see that from the year 2012, Africa's exports, have begun rising, increasing marginally, giving some sense of hope that yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel. So for Africa to be able to realize its agricultural potential, we would have to be self-sufficient. We would have to graduate smallholder farmers from subsistence production to commercial and agribusiness level production. So families can feed themselves, become food secure, reduce their poverty levels, and also have enough food to export, within the African region or to the international markets. Malachy, next slide, please. It is amazing, and it is very clear that agriculture is about 11 times more effective in relieving poverty in Africa. There's no doubt about that. But then how can we get to that point with the massive resources at our disposal? there is a vast amount of untapped natural resources. Rivers, huge fertile lands at our disposal. What can we do to these resources to help us to transform our current situation to become self-sufficient and food secure? Now, looking at our land tenure system, there's been a lot of land tenure reforms across the region. And investors, both abroad and within the continent, can take advantage of it. Because, for instance, in Ghana, investors can come in, partner with local institutions, partner with, landowners, get into some kind of agreement, and then have access to good land to produce for the market. And these are beginning to take shape across the length and breadth of Africa. Politically, governments must rise up, to create the enabling environment to create growth and transformation within the agricultural sector, where government should rise up and lay the foundation to allow some kind of public-private partnerships, to roll across the continent to ensure that there is enough food for the people. Next slide, please. Now, looking at trade within the region, it is one of the tools that Africa can use to ensure its self-sufficiency. And recently, the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade has officially been opened in Accra, Ghana, which is a major milestone in the implementation of the free trade agreement within the region. And I'm of the view that this increase in trade is the surest way for Africa to deepen its regional integration. So, looking at both intra-regional trade and international trade is vital for Africa to become self-sufficient. Formation of farmer cooperatives. Farmers are disjointed, everybody in their corner doing their little farming and then negotiating their own prices when their commodities are ready for the market. And this is not the best approach. There should be the formation of cooperatives. Farmers should come together, have one voice to be able to negotiate their products. Their products are very well produced in commercial quantities so they can bargain and have very fair prices for their commodities. Infrastructure, private investment is key for the transformation of African agriculture. Investors all over the world are being invited to come down into Africa to come and invest in infrastructure, to come and invest, in other areas along the food chain. So together, we can be able to help Africa to produce enough to feed itself and also export to generate good revenue to show up the economies of countries within the continent. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, how has foreign direct investments played out in the region from 1996 up until 2018? It's been very clear that a lot of countries in Africa has not been able to position themselves very well to attract foreign investments into the agriculture sector. And this is an area African governments must set up to create an enabling environment, create the appropriate structures to allow easy transfer, of foreign investments into the agriculture sector across the economies of Africa to enable a total transformation from where we are now. Ghana has done very well. If you look at the graph, Ghana has done very well in terms of attracting huge foreign direct investments into its economy to shore up the agribusiness sector. The other countries can follow up and learn from Ghana to be able to create the appropriate structures to attract very, very good foreign investments. Next slide, please. Now, one of the major challenges of the region is the yields of our produce. Agricultural yields are the lowest worldwide. And these yields are lowest because there's poor fertilizer use, there's limited access to credit, there are limited irrigation facilities and infrastructure. There's lack of farmer expertise, to engage in efficient agricultural practices, and then low soil fertility. Now, if we're able to transform these problems, these challenges that is facing the sector within the region, we will be able to improve yields significantly. And once yields are improved, food security will be improved. Economies of countries will be improved. And livelihood generally would be improved significantly. And this will allow farmers to move from subsistence production to commercial production to sustain the gains made for a better future for the continent. Better fertilizer use, sustainable energy application, and innovative technologies should be encouraged to kind of create a balance to improve the agricultural phase of the continent. Next slide, please. Next slide.
That's it. Okay.
Right. So for instance, right. So looking at the yields of commodities, for instance, you could see on the graph maize yields from 1970 to 2018, and it's very clear that Africa, West Africa has not done very well compared to countries like Brazil and India. So this is a challenge that I feel that the technologies exist for to enable us to increase our yields of commodities cultivated in Africa, grown in Africa. The technology exists somewhere, others have done it, they have been successful. We need to import these technologies and kind of adapt it to suit our situation. So we could also increase our yields, significantly to create the transformation that is needed. So I will thank you very much for hearing me, and I'll hand over to Malachy.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I agree with everything you say. I think one of the many nemesis that Africa faces in agriculture is low yields and all the issues around that, and climate smart agriculture where there can be an increase in yields can really potentially address the food insecurity issues that exist on the continent. But importantly, they can also bolster the prospects for exports, which are very important in terms of import substitution and in terms of generating badly needed foreign reserves. So it's a win-win, and it's the first place really to start, and that's all about government policy. But it's also about the private sector, and you mentioned that, I think, also in terms of the role they have to play and to be incentivized properly. And the issue around access to affordable capital, most countries on the continent of Africa have interest rates ranging from 15 to 30%, which is just not sustainable for the private sector to operate at that level. So it's a continent of enormous opportunity, but enormous challenge, and certainly one that we're very committed to as a business and working with a number of companies and clients already in the region. And we see great opportunity in the agricultural economy in right across in Ghana and indeed right across the continent. So to try and bring things maybe a little bit together, and we have a few questions, and to wrap things up, if the question we really posed was, can we create a more resilient food system? And we would kind of give you 6 takeaways from today. And one is a better domestic production, reduced disruption risk, self-sufficiency. I think it's within the gift of many countries to pursue self-sufficiency, or at least go part of the way. However, where resources are restricted, particularly when it comes to things like water, it's very important that countries have a policy, a very clear policy, not to produce crops that are water intensive, and to look at alternative means through maybe technology, ag tech, and obviously then relying on the global food system to supply those products or that produce. But better domestic production is a good place to start, and we just talked about Africa, but there's also that can be applied to really across the world. Strategic reserves have a really important role to play, and how they're managed, and we saw what Switzerland are doing, and indeed other countries, governments have control of strategic reserves, but they have a real role to play in terms of smoothing out the shocks that come and go within the global food system. And those shocks have been with us and will stay with us and will most likely increase. So they're a very important part of the system. Open trade facilitates access to agri-food products. Trade is absolutely vital. What we have seen is, during this pandemic, and indeed pre the pandemic, is a rise in protectionism. And ultimately protectionism serves nobody, whether it comes to the supply of labor or indeed the supply of food, trading between nations. It is really important that we have open and transparent, and importantly fair trade between nations. And any hindrance to that will ultimately serve no one well, not least consumers. Diversified supply chains are important to minimize local disruptions, and also to bring a diversity which is important and increasingly important for consumers. Shorter supply chains help to reduce risks and also environmental impact, and I think we're seeing as a management consulting firm a greater emphasis on shorter supply chains, and I think there's a real opportunity for companies, particularly in the Middle East and the GCC, to have win-win partnerships in Africa, where the natural resources are there, but the capital isn't there, to produce crops that can provide supply local markets, but also supply markets back in their home countries of the GCC. And we see greater interest in that area as well. And then investment, and that's absolutely key. Investment in technology, food tech, ag tech, in climate smart agriculture, and investment in infrastructure, in some cases very basic infrastructure in Africa in particular, in irrigation and roads for routes to market and storage. The majority of food loss in the developed world is in post-harvest. It's in the developing world is post-harvest. In the developed world, it's really from the plate waste that is left on food plates at consumer level. But the majority in the developing world is taking place at post-harvest. Up to 30 to 40% of crops, due to poor storage, poor handling facilities, lack of processing capacity, etc., are all contributing to food loss, which is something that can be addressed and should be addressed. So we move on to some questions, and I've just been given some questions here that we have time for just a few as we're running on. And I'll go to you, Najeeb, first. And the question is, how can countries with low water resources and climates that are not conducive to arable production, such as the GCC markets, bolster their food security?
Magic answer: invest in R&D. Well, investment in R&D is very important at this stage to stimulate innovative food production. Agri-tech such as hydroponic, aeroponic, etc., is a very growing phenomenon that should continue to be exploited. A successful production of fresh produce through the use of this technology for sure will strengthen the self-sufficiency. In Saudi Arabia, Neom City project is a good example, really, investing in R&D and innovative approaches to self-sufficiency in certain, of course, not all products, certain food products. I think in the GCC overall, we should really capitalize on our strength wherever it's possible. For example, in Saudi Arabia, we have strength on dairy production, poultry, dairy product, and we have as well we have to import food from a diverse range of source internationally to maximize sourcing efficiency and as well to reduce the risk of cutting supplies. I hope I answered this question.
Thanks, Najeeb. Stephen, one for you. The coronavirus has exposed a lot of problems with the global supply chain. How can vulnerable countries get the balance right between improving self-sufficiency while still engaging in international trade?
Thank you, Malachy. I feel that the coronavirus has come to kind of expose the weaknesses, and how vulnerable we are as countries and as a continent. To be able to have the balance right, to be able to be self-sufficient whilst still engaging in international trade, I think it boils down to the fact that smallholder farmers, needs to be kind of promoted or graduated from producing at a subsistence level, and then exposing them to commercial farming using the best of innovative technology and inputs that we have. Other countries, Asia has done it and they've been successful. Europe has done it and they've been successful. So I feel that it is time for the smallholder farmers to be able to push, giving a little push to kind of push, get it to the next level of production, where they could be using high yielding, climate resilient seeds, for instance, and then also improve, also be given a very improved access to finance. Collateral issues, should be sorted out, and there should be some kind of in guarantee, credit guarantees provided for the smallholder farmers. And in this area, I would say that Nigeria and Ghana have kind of taken the lead by setting up the agricultural incentive risk-based, system, where they partner with financial institutions to kind of help the financial institutions to reduce the risk of investing into farmers' businesses. So financial institutions will have the confidence to invest to farmers. So I feel that these are the things we need to do as Africa to help farmers to increase productivity. And once productivity is increased, we can feed ourselves and also have a balance to, get into the international trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. One question for myself: what are my views on consolidation within the food industry? I think it's inevitable, and it's consolidation has been with us, particularly post World War II. We've seen enormous consolidation and an enormous increase in output and efficiency, green revolution, etc., in agriculture, and all of these things act as a catalyst for consolidation. In saying all that as well, we haven't mentioned much about the retail sector, and in the developed part of the world, where 80-90% now of food purchased for home use comes through a small number, in some cases in the UK, 5-6 major multiple supermarkets. That in itself has also driven enormous price competition and consolidation right across the supply chain. So I think it's inevitable, but it also brings benefits in terms of scale. Will bring benefits obviously in terms of reduced unit cost, but it also brings risks. And we talked about some of those risks in terms of concentrating the issues around if there are supply outages, if there's issues in terms of food safety, and of course then dominance and the issue it has then with suppliers and buyers on both sides. In Africa, smallholder farmers, which are a subsistence agricultural system, and that's the backbone of the African agricultural system, in itself will not feed Africa. And so there is need for scale in Africa, and that has to be in a sustainable, climate smart basis. So I think it's very necessary there, and also to develop its whole supply chain system as well, for it to feed itself, and as I said earlier, potentially to contribute to the global supply system as well. We'll maybe just take one last question, and before we wrap things up, and that's to you, Najeeb. What will the impact on the global food and agricultural sector of a continuation of the COVID-19 pandemic? What do you think that impact will be?
Thank you, Malachy. Well, I think historically, the food and agri sector has proven to be very resilient. But however, over the last few months, we have seen various industries have been putting plans in place to ensure that food production continues as normal and safety as possible. Of course, it's not that easy, especially with the alarming rate and confirmed growing cases, positive cases on both Brazil and India. That may well result in shortage of certain food product in the future, resulting maybe higher price. But we accept this kind of disruption will be back to normal to stabilize on the mid or long term. Of course, during the past few months, we learned a lot about the flow of the global food system. And we keep learning, and we try to get the best of the pandemic and to be shared worldwide with the experts in order to to be ready whenever we have a crisis similar to such. Thank you, Malachy.
Thank you, Najeeb. So I think we better move on and wrap things up. There's been, just looking, there's some really interesting questions. We're not able to get around to them. I want to thank everyone for their questions, and please feel free to continue the conversation with us. You'll have or you'll see our contact details on our website, so feel free to reach out if you have any queries or anything that's been raised today, or wish to continue our discussion in any way. Also, I can say that the actual report that we've been just discussing is now available on our website, and it can be downloaded. Also, there are other white papers there in relation to various areas and aspects we publish on the global food system, and areas that we're very active and working on. Our team is on an ongoing basis. We'll also have some additional webinars coming up and discussions. The next one will be on water, and particularly Saudi Arabia and GCC, and the importance of water, a vital resource, and very much linked to agriculture. We'll also be talking about due diligence, environmental, social governance, and sustainability, and how that applies to the global food investment sector. And also looking at areas around ag tech and food tech. So lots of webinars and discussions coming up. We'll obviously keep you informed through social media and through our email platform as well. So just to conclude, I suppose we've, I think, had a reasonably good discussion, and on some positive notes, the global food system has tripled since 1970 and population has doubled. So it has proven to be not just resilient, but also have the capacity to feed the world to a large extent. And the number of people who have little to eat has dropped in that period from 36% to 11%. It's still too high, and it's still an issue that has to be obviously addressed. And 4/5 of the world rely on food they consume to be produced in a different country. So global trade is not going to go away anytime soon. It's not just an interconnected world we live in, but it's fundamental to the food that people consume. And if they want to continue to have variety, and if they want to continue to have availability of the food they want to eat, the global food system is absolutely fundamental to that. But we have to make it a lot more sustainable. And I think that's the challenge, that's the opportunity. And over the next 30 years, we need to increase output by 50%, but we need to decrease emissions by at least 50%. So there's lots of challenges, but also lots of opportunities for all of us that work in this industry. Thank you all of the participants, the attendees. We've had a fantastic interest and number attending here today, our webinar, and we're delighted to have hosted it. We hope you found it informative, and thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you and have a good day.